Does the excitement never end? Welcome to another Persiflager's podcast to review the infectious disease literature with snarky commentary for the last 2 weeks of August 2007. For those of you who are sick of this intro, skip ahead to the next chapter. Available, as always, on iTunes. Brought to you by Puscast LLC, the publisher of the Persiflager's annotated compendium of infectious disease facts, dogma, and opinion. Your uber-hyperlinked electronic guide to infectious disease at pusware.com. All the opinions are those of me and Puscast LLC and not those of anyone else who knows a burrow from a burrow. This is CME accredited. Listen, take the online quiz and get a half an hour of free CME thanks to Legacy Health Systems. Because this is CME accredited, I have to mention my potential conflicts of interest. None. There. Biases I have by the bucket loads, but no financial conflicts to report. I'm pure as the driven snow, and you know how the snow is these days with global warming. As a warning, this is not called Persiflagers for nothing. The podcast will probably contain snide comments, sarcastic asides, and short rants on political and other contemporary issues. Now you're warned, don't complain. If you like this sort of thing, listen to my Quackcast, where I review complementary and alternative medicine and the evidence or lack thereof to support it. This is also available on iTunes. If you like either of these podcasts, please write me a review. Otherwise, the literature references are all online, and now there's something new. I think I have it done so that if you click on the PubMed button on the reference, you'll be taken right to the PubMed abstract. So that's available on the Pusware reference webpage for this particular and future podcasts. It's a little extra work, so if you like it, let me know. Or don't. I don't care. I'm like NPR. I talk to the air. Nobody listens. I always like to start with the doomsday issues first. And so the first doomsday issue is avian influenza. This was a report on the epidemiology of the outbreak in Indonesia that occurred last year. Like all cases of avian influenza, people have gotten it primarily from their chickens, and so Colonel Sanders had better beware. But there were several other interesting features with this particular outbreak. The first was that the case mortality rate was 76%, which was pretty impressive. They postulated this may have been due to seeking medical care late, as those who died tended to come in later in their illness and therefore did not get medical support. It also is a possibility that the organism is becoming more virulent, and because it occurred in familial clusters, perhaps these families had a genetic predisposition to having a bad response to avian influenza. Be that as it may, it is of interest to note that there could be person-to-person contact if you're having very close exposure to patients' respiratory secretions who have avian influenza. As we head into the influenza coughing season, I think it's a good time to point out that the cough is an extremely effective way to spread infectious diseases, and that when your patient is coughing, they are infecting you. Wear a mask, make the patient wear a mask. Remember that patients who cough can give it to you. We tend to be a little too sanguine about people who cough. There was another study that supported the potential human-to-human spread of avian influenza in clusters, that it has the mathematical and epidemiologic pattern that strongly suggests that it is spread human-to-human if you get enough aerosolization of avian influenza into your lungs. So remember, when you're seeing a patient, don't inhale. We have talked in the past about the importance of keeping patients with resistant virus on antiretrovirals because it probably slows the progression of the disease. But at what rate? Well, this study looked at resistance and outcomes in patients with HIV disease and found that if you had resistance to 2 classes of antiretrovirals, then you had a 2-fold increased risk of death and progression of disease. And if you had 3 classes of viral resistance, then you had a 3-fold increased risk of death and progression to AIDS. But that's sort of a nice rule of thumb. 2 antiretroviral class resistance, double the progression. 3 antiretroviral class resistance, triple the progression. The pathophysiology of HIV disease, I think, remains fascinating. Most people who get infected with HIV have the following pathophysiologic response. The HIV first binds to the CD4 receptor, but then it undergoes a conformational change and it binds to a chemokine receptor, and in most cases is the CCR5 receptor. This one accounts for most infections. There is also another type of virus that binds to a different chemokine, the CXCR4 receptor. This is rare, but does occur in patients who have a CCR5 base pair deletion. Now, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to have the CXCR4 strain, you're more likely to have a rapid progression of disease. There's a report in the Clinics of Infectious Diseases of a patient who had his initial HIV infection with the standard HIV, and then a couple years later got a co-infection with a new strain of HIV that went after the CCR5 receptor, and he had a marked progression of his HIV disease. The take-home message to this is that there are multiple mechanisms by which HIV can infect your cells, some more virulent than others, and that just because you have HIV disease, you should not presume you are safe having unprotected risk factors with other HIV patients, because it's conceivable that you could either acquire or spread not only resistant strains of HIV, which is a big problem and a growing problem, but you could also pass on a new strain with more virulence and kill people faster. An article in the Journal of Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome looked at the issue of low replicative, there's a word I can't pronounce, capacity of HIV and outcomes. Patients who had more slowly replicating HIV because of drugs, even though they were resistant to the drugs, had a slower decline in their CD4 counts. So the more rapidly HIV replicates, the faster it kills off your CD4 cells. And again, this may be due to resistant strains, or if you're unlucky enough to get a strain that has duotropisms for your chemokine receptor, you are in a world of hurt. It's been known for some time that neurologic impairment is a big problem in HIV disease. The initial studies were in the New England Journal of Medicine last century. Unfortunately, as evidenced in an article in the journal AIDS, this may be somewhat permanent. In this study, they looked at neurocognitive function in HIV patients and found that once their CD4 counts went below 200, there was an increase in their neurocognitive impairment in these patients. However, and unfortunately, that when CD4 counts came back to above 200, they did not get complete resolution of neurocognitive impairment. So that heart, while very beneficial, may not be the be-all, end-all if you get some brain dysfunction because of your HIV disease. There was a case report in Clinical Infectious Diseases of an anesthesiologist who had hepatitis C because he was a drug user. He took care of a total of 1,200 patients who he gave anesthesia to, and of these, 33 patients developed by genetic testing infections with his strain of hepatitis C. It's estimated that maybe 1% of hepatitis C is spread nosocomially, but this is a remarkable spread of disease. Now, they don't mention it in this study, but I would wonder if it has less to do with who was infected, but whether or not the anesthesiologist was following proper infection control policies. The other possibility which was alluded to in this study was that he gave a little morphine to the patient, a little morphine to the anesthesiologist, a little more morphine for the anesthesiologist, a little more morphine for the anesthesiologist, and then a little more for the patient. So perhaps there was sharing of needles inadvertently. That possibility is alluded to but not stated directly in the paper. So still at question from this study is exactly how the hepatitis C was spread from anesthesiologist to the patient. Was it a breakdown in infection control procedures, or was the needle that was being used by the anesthesiologist being shared with his patients as well? When you look at the rates of infection in married couples, I would bet there's more here than just casual contact that led to the acquisition of hepatitis C. We make now a transition from heart to heart. Thank you. Please try the prime rib. I'll be here all week. In this case, the issue is heart transplants and cytomegalovirus, or as I like to call it, cytomegalovirus. By the way, it's Cefazolin, not Cefazolin. It's debridement, not debride. Debride is the woman who walks down the aisle of the church. Anyway, CMV and heart transplant patients. This looked at what happened to heart transplant patients over a 10-year period of time at the University of Washington. And the patients received varying types of immunosuppression and varying types of anti-CMV prevention during this time. And sort of here's the key take-home message in this group. Despite prophylaxis, patients got CMV. 11% of patients developed CMV, and it led to very long hospitalizations, 66 days. So this disease ain't cheap. And then because of prophylaxis, of course, resistance developed, and 1.5% of patients developed CMV that was resistant to ganciclovir. And the alternative medications in this population to treat CMV disease were quite toxic. So my advice to you is if you get your heart transplanted, your best bet is to be CMV negative and to get a CMV negative heart, and then never acquire CMV. Easier said than done. Do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. This is increasingly true in infectious diseases, where alterations in what are called the toll-like receptors are associated with increased or decreased risks of infections. In this case, an article in Clinical Infectious Diseases looked at polymorphisms in the TLR2 receptor and found that patients were more likely to have herpes and to have increased viral shedding of genital herpes if they had certain polymorphisms in the toll-like receptors. This was specifically found for toll-like receptor 2, which certain polymorphisms were associated with either increased shedding or increased lesional rates of genital herpes. These toll-like receptors are ancient parts of the immune system that are even found in trees, and increasing evidence points to alterations in this pathway, both increasing and decreasing susceptibilities to virtually every type of infection. So when one patient gets sick and another doesn't, the answer may not be in the organism, but may be in the genetics of the patient themselves. The secret of this, like being a marathon runner, is to choose your parents wisely. Fortunately, however, you can prevent herpes, and a recent meta-analysis of all the different studies showed that famciclovir, valacyclovir, and acyclovir were all equal in prevention of genital herpes. So the only thing to correlate with which one you should give should be cost. Whether you give acyclovir 400 BID, valacyclovir 250 BID, or famciclovir 250 BID, or valcyclovir 500 once a day, all four regimens are equivalent and all will decrease your chance of recurrence by about half. Now, if a drug rep would just take me out to dinner at El Gaucho for a good steak dinner, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable reason to give one of their agents in preference to others for patients with genital herpes. Yes, I'm letting you know I'm for sale. Cat scratch disease is an interesting disease. Well, actually, all infectious diseases are interesting. I still don't know how anyone could go into another subspecialty. Probably because they want to get paid for their job. But be that as it may, there are some interesting neurologic manifestations of cat scratch. The most commonly seen are an aggressive encephalopathy and coma, and occasionally seizures as well. CID this month has 2 case reports of transverse myelitis due to cat scratch disease, i.e. Bartonella-Hensley, and they say there's another one in the literature. The big question would be whether or not transverse myelitis, which is a fairly unusual disease, is more commonly caused by cat scratch than we suspect because we don't normally look for it. So if you should get called to see a rare case of transverse myelitis, think of Ted Nugent's disease or cat scratch fever. Banana. Rock on! Many times, I'm sure you have heard me say that the 3 reasons that we live into our 80s are flush toilets, good nutrition, and vaccines. Might I add to that list pasteurization, one of the great public health discoveries of all time. I mention this because there is a big, well, not so big, but there is a underground economy based on getting unpasteurized milk. There are two ways that this is done. In places like New York City, people have speakeasies that they go to where they knock on the door and they say Mycobacterium bovis, and then it opens up and they can get access to unpasteurized milk. The other way is to have a part-time ownership in a cow, a so-called cow share. This is from the Bible injunction, beat your swords into cow shares. If you own a cow, or if you own a herd of cows, or if you own part of a cow, then you can drink its milk without having to worry about pasteurization. And we've had some outbreaks here in the Pacific Northwest traced back to people getting their infection from their cow share. While it was E. coli OH157 here in the Great Pacific Northwest, there are other potential pathogens that are found in unpasteurized milk. In this study, they looked at unpasteurized milk before it got to the pasteurization area in Wisconsin. They found that 76% of the samples had Coxiella burnetii in it. That's the cause of Q fever. And also, they found listeria in 5% of the samples, which is not unsurprising, as listeria is a common part of the cow gastrointestinal tract. It's now part of my routine history in unknown infections to ask patients if they eat or drink foods that they don't obtain from grocery stores, and I specifically now ask about unpasteurized milk. But when you get that flyer in the mail about getting a Hawaiian cow share, well, I think you might ignore it. Now that you've had your glass of milk, I have what I think is a really, really cool paper. Now, bacteria are more than just bacteria. I've often said that bacteria are actually one enormous organism coating the world, because the frequency with which they can exchange genes means that unlike us, who cannot share genes with a donkey, bacteria can share their genes with other bacteria and each other with alarming frequency. I always state this by saying right now, as you sit there, bacteria are having sex and exchanging genetic code in your colon. Now, this turns out, I discovered today, to be an actual scientific hypothesis called the distributive genome hypothesis. Their hypothesis is that bacteria have a core set of genes that every bacteria carries, and then there's a large number of non-core genes that is distributed throughout the organism and can be used through recombination to develop new strains of organisms. This has been shown with Streptococcus agalactiae and Haemophilus influenza, that they have this so-called supergenome. An article published this month looked at the supergenome of Streptococcus pneumoniae, and they figure that the organism has 5,000 gene clusters. Of these gene clusters, 3,000 of them are distributed throughout the organisms and only found in a given organism 0.1% of the time. So Strep pneumoniae not only has its own genome, but it probably has this supergenome that is included in all the organisms that can be accessed when different strains meet and mate. This is like distributive computing. However, in this case, the genome of the organism is spread in more places than just a given individual organism, and helps account for the wide variety in virulence that we see in organisms. What is heteroresistance? Well, I'm going to avoid the cheap joke here. You can fill in the blank. When it comes to bacteria, heteroresistance is the fact that when you have a susceptible organism, there will sometimes be daughter cells that have increased resistance to the antibiotic being tested. So while all your Staph aureus looks to be susceptible to nafcillin, there will be daughter populations that will have higher MICs to nafcillin. This has been described primarily in Staph aureus, but of interest, this has now been shown to occur in Streptococcus pneumoniae. They took a bunch of Strep pneumoniae from clinical specimens and looked for heteroresistance, and found that although these organisms were susceptible to penicillin, there were daughter populations that occurred at a rate of about 10 to the minus 3 to 10 to the minus 6 that were either intermediate or even resistant to penicillin. The genetic mechanism of heteroresistance in strep pneumoniae is not yet known, but it is an important clinical concept in that when you treat an infection, you should always give the maximal dose of antibiotics for as short a period of time as possible. What allows strains like these heteroresistant strains to come to the forefront is if you give a piddly-ass amount of antibiotic for a long period of time, and that's the kind of selective pressure that leads to resistance. I sometimes think my average patient now is 400 pounds, and if you give them 250 milligrams of amoxicillin TID, based on their volume and distribution, you're basically giving patients subtherapeutic levels and breeding heteroresistant strains of strep pneumo and probably other organisms as well. 2 epidemiologic risks you need to know about of interest this month. The first is for Streptococcus canis, which, not unsurprisingly, you get from dogs. This has been associated with infected ulcers in human beings, as well as cellulitis and bacteremia, with usually a good outcome as the organism is susceptible. They do point out in both of these studies, however, that most labs will not go beyond saying it's a group G strep, and if you happen to have a patient with a dog exposure and a group G strep in their blood, you might ask the lab for entertainment's sake to see if it's a Streptococcus canis or not. The other is Streptococcus suis, which you can see comes probably from pigs. Most of these cases have been in Southeast Asia and in China, where they had an outbreak that was associated with the toxic shock-like syndrome that had about a 20% mortality rate. And there have also been ongoing problems in Vietnam with Streptococcus suis. To date, there's only been one case in the United States, and that was someone who was a pig farmer in New York City. But given the rate at which animals and humans travel the world, I would not be surprised if a Streptococcus suis makes it to the United States and spreads. I expect, since it's associated with swine, to see massive outbreaks associated with both the Democratic and Republican national conventions next year. It's too bad I didn't have a report on any infections associated with oysters that I could have talked about first. Then I could have had pearls before swine. Shakespeare got it wrong. What we have is a plague on all our houses, and that plague right now is MRSA. A couple studies out this month. The first is how often is MRSA, I personally hate saying MRSA, but how often MRSA is found in family members of patients with this disease. This study was done in Sweden and looked at 114 household contacts over a 6-year period who had MRSA. And 70% of household contacts with the initial patient had MRSA, and it was the same MRSA in almost every case. They also documented transmission of MRSA between adults and parents, between children and parents, between grandparents and children, and between siblings. So with one member of the family has MRSA, you can consider the whole family awash in MRSA. And whether or not working on a decontamination would be effective is unknown. However, if you're interested in a decontamination procedure, there is one at my website on the Staph aureus section of Pusware. Where do they carry the staph? Well, I tend to think of MRSA carriers like Pigpen of Charlie Brown, awash in a haze of skin cells and Staph aureus. But a surprising number of house staff have not seen a Charlie Brown Christmas and don't understand that particular reference. Further evidence, as if any is needed, that I'm increasingly an old geezer. This is also problematic because there are states that have mandated culturing patients on admission for MRSA carriage. I think Illinois is one of them, and the question is, where should you culture them? Well, this study was published in the Clinical Infectious Disease and compared the results of nasal cultures versus throat cultures in patients who had MRSA as a screening mechanism. In this study, they found a total of 37% of patients had MRSA in their nose, but they found that almost 13% only had MRSA in their throat. They say that screening of throat swabs in addition to the nose increases the detection of carriers by almost a quarter. So if you're going to culture patients for MRSA carriage rate, you need not only to do the nose, but you need to do the throat as well. Whether you should be doing other bodily parts in addition, such as open sores or the axilla or big fat skin folds, I have no idea. Your best way to maximize your yield would probably be to put the patient into a blender, puree them, and then plate the entire amount on an enormous blood agar plate. What to do about MRSA when it is in a family or other group is also problematic and is probably an exercise in futility. In the study that looked at topical mupirocin to the nose, found it did not do much. What they did was they had military recruits, and they screened 3,400 of them, and they found 130, which is about 4%, that had MRSA in their nose. They then either treated them with placebo or with topical mupirocin, and it did nothing. 4% of those who were not colonized with MRSA went on to develop MRSA infections, and 3.5% of patients who had mupirocin due to MRSA went on to develop infections. Not only that, but new patients became colonized with MRSA during the study period. I think the take-home message for this is if you have a confined group, which is what soldiers are, that have MRSA in it, just treating the nose is going to do nothing to either eradicate MRSA in the population or prevent spread of disease and acquisition of disease in such a population. It would only take massive and probably impossible decontamination procedures to remove MRSA from the environment. I personally think that what's going to remove MRSA from the environment is eventually we're going to have some sort of herd immunity that will lead to a decrease in the incidence, or is it the prevalence, I never remember, of this disease in the community, and that all the antibiotics and decontaminations and other things we do to try and eradicate this organism are truly a waste of time, money, and only are going to breed further resistance. I think, however, that's a minority opinion. Besides multiply resistant Staph aureus, we have multiply resistant Pseudomonads, and what to do about it. What to do? Well, maybe colistin is the answer. This is an interesting study that looked at invasive multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas infections over time and compared outcomes to those who had colistin versus those who had standard anti-pseudomonal therapy. Those who had the colistin were younger but tended to have more nosocomally acquired infections. And what was interesting in this study is that the colistin patients actually responded almost 3 times as much as the patients who were treated with standard therapy. Now, this is interesting, but they were small numbers, only 40 in each group. And as mentioned, the colistin series was about a decade younger than the standard therapy. But colistin, at least parentally, is a good alternative in multi-resistant Pseudomonads and other gram-negative rods, remembering, of course, not to give it as inhalational therapy, which has perhaps killed a couple people this year. I don't know how often you use the pneumonia severity score in deciding where to send your patients who require admission for pneumonia. This score is available on the internet and multiple other sites, including, of course, my website. The importance of this is it predicts mortality, and if you have a class 5, you are likely to have a high mortality rate. Now, the interesting thing about this particular study in chest is they looked at patients with that and saw what happened to them, and that as a rule, only 20% actually went to the ICU. Older patients tended to be the ones who went to the ward, and patients with multi-organ failure tended to be the ones that went to the ICU. But both groups had a significant mortality rate. Those who went to the ICU had a 37% mortality rate, but 20% of class 5s that went to the floor died. Now, being older and having more comorbidities, it may have been, well, let's give it a try and see what happens sort of thing. But 1 out of 5 dying is pretty good. And so if you have a class 5 and the patient is full go, you should probably have them in the unit for closer monitoring. For my next cranky rant, how come you shouldn't say PJP pneumonia? Answer, the second P stands for pneumonia. So if you say PJP pneumonia, you're saying Pneumocystis cerevisiae pneumonia, which is stupid, so stop it. Besides that, there is a practical study out on the risk factors for developing PJP, and it is the use of infliximab, which is an anti-tumor necrosis factor that is used in both Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and other diseases. They looked at the number of cases of PJP reported to the FDA for this agent over a 5-year period, and they found 84 cases of PJP following infliximab therapy. These patients were often on other immunosuppressants such as methotrexate, prednisone, azathioprine, and cyclosporin. But the important thing here is that patients who developed pneumocystis tend to develop it early, with 21 days being the mean time from the onset of infusion and the acquisition of pneumocystis. And a whopping 1/3 of them died, which is pretty impressive. So be leery of patients starting infliximab and the development of PJP. Should they be on pneumocystis prophylaxis with an every other day Bactrim? I think that might be very reasonable, especially if they're heavily immunocompetent. But there's no data to support that I am aware of. Also, while we're talking about it, don't say PIN number when you go use your bank card, because the N stands for number. As I said before, now that I'm 50 years old and have my AARP card, I get to be indiscriminately grumpy without any particular reason whatsoever. It's one of the benefits of being elderly. Empiric antibiotics are always problematic in that you know that if you use antibiotics over time, resistance increases, but if you don't use the right antibiotics, the patient may die. This was brought home yet again in the study in antimicrobial agents and chemotherapy that looked at mortality in patients with bloodstream infections caused by patients who had extended spectrum beta-lactamase producing E. coli and Klebsiella. And they found that patients who had inadequate antibiotic had a increased chance of dying compared to those who didn't. And this is a 3-fold increase in mortality. So most of these patients were treated with cephalosporins or fluoroquinolones, which often don't work at ESBLs. So if you should have ESBLs in your community and this patient should have a risk for that, it is of note that you should probably put them on appropriate therapy empirically, with the knowledge that if it turns out that they don't have an ESBL, you can always change antibiotics. One of the things that always boggles my mind as an infectious disease doctor is how often people prescribe antibiotics with zero knowledge of the statistical susceptibilities of the organisms you're treating. Might I just say that if you're going to treat a staph infection and you cannot recite what the percentage resistance rates are to the antibiotic you are prescribing, or to any other organism for that matter, you should look it up or not be prescribing that drug. I'm an old grumpy man with an ARIP card. In the United States, we are lucky in that we have lots of diabetes, but we don't have a lot of tuberculosis. Well, maybe lucky is not the right word. But you may be asking yourself, is the impact of diabetes on tuberculosis? This study was published in Clinics of Infectious Diseases and was out of Indonesia, where they looked at 737 patients. This was a study that was sponsored by Boeing, who had pulmonary tuberculosis, and looked at those who had diabetes as well. Almost 15% of patients had diabetes, and they tended to be older and tended to be fatter, as would be expected. Now, the interesting thing is, while their presentation was the same and they did not have more severe tuberculosis, patients who had diabetes were much slower at resolving their disease. At 2 months of therapy, diabetic patients were still smear positive almost 20% of the time versus 10% of the time in patients without diabetes. And at 6 months, 22% of the cultured sputums in diabetics still had tuberculosis in it. So always it's the host that's important in treating infections. And if you should happen to have a diabetic with tuberculosis, don't be so sanguine they're going to get better with the usual speed. 2 issues with orthopedic infections. One, which is no surprise, is that patients who have MRSA in an artificial joint are more likely to fail medical therapy and more likely to have their joint out. Next up, water is wet, fire is hot. The more interesting orthopedic study asked the question, should you withhold perioperative antibiotics in patients who have an infected joint? And this resulted in the answer no. They looked at patients as to whether or not they got a dose of antibiotics before sampling their joints, and found that despite finding infection at the time of surgery, the false negative rate for infections was the same in both groups. So 9 of 72 patients who had intraoperative cultures who had received antibiotics, i.e. 12.5%, had a false negative. And in those who did not receive perioperative antibiotics, 8 of 99 had a false negative culture. So that was about 8%. So 12.5% of those who got antibiotics had a negative culture, and 8% of those who did not get antibiotics had a negative culture. So this was not statistically significant. Now, the issue, of course, is if you withhold perioperative antibiotics, you may increase your wound infection rate, and this was not addressed in this study. But if you get asked by an orthopedic surgeon, should I give perioperative antibiotics at cut time if I'm going to be sampling a joint, the answer is probably it's okay. You're going to isolate the organism anyway. This study only counts for the single preoperative dose of antibiotics and does not address the issue as to whether or not someone who's been on antibiotics for several weeks should have their antibiotics stopped, and if so, how far ahead of time should the antibiotics be stopped before you sample a space. That data is still, to my knowledge, unknown. This is one of those clinical studies coming up that contradicts one of my, well, maybe not so deeply held beliefs, but one of my clinical opinions, and this is what to do about patients who have secondary peritonitis. Should they have a second surgery just on basic principles, a look-see to see what's going on, or follow the patient along and see what's going on? My bias has come from years of spending time in a trauma unit where the patients routinely go for look-see laparotomies after major abdominal trauma, complicated by infections, for a washout and to make sure everything was as it should be. In non-trauma unit areas, surgeons were less likely to do this. Now, these are different patient groups, obviously, but it had been my impression that it was better to go in and look around than not in these patients. I was wrong. This study was published in JAMA and looked at the difference between an on-demand, i.e. the patient had clinical signs and symptoms that warranted an exploratory laparotomy again, versus patients who had a planned one, regardless of clinical symptoms. In the patients who had the on-demand relaparotomy, while they did not have a decrease in death rates or other peritonitis-related morbidity, they did have fewer surgeries, fewer medical costs, and less healthcare utilization. And, it's not good to go to the OR unless you need to. So I think this study, which was very well done, is fairly definitive that when you have a case of secondary peritonitis, watch and wait, and only take them back to the operating room if the clinical indicators say it is necessary, and not do it just on general principles. Again, I don't think this necessarily applies to trauma patients who have far more going on than infection, but still, I think a useful trial for those of us who take care of these patients for a living. There has long been this interesting literature about the immunomodulatory effects of antibiotics, specifically tetracyclines and macrolides, and whether some of the benefits you get in some infectious diseases from macrolides and strep pneumo are due to their immunomodulatory effects. I've always been somewhat skeptical, and I usually don't go with animal studies in this podcast, but I found this one interesting. And this was an animal model of Staph aureus brain abscesses, where they used a minocycline-resistant Staph aureus to cause brain abscesses in mice, and then they looked at the outcomes. And they found improved outcomes in the minocycline. And this was thought to be due to the fact that it decreased pro-inflammatory mediators such as interleukin and CCL2. These patients, these mice, I sometimes confuse my patients with mice, also had less necrotic damage and smaller abscesses, and this was interesting in that the organism was resistant to minocycline. So it appeared that there was beneficial effects of the minocycline due to its immunomodulatory effects, at least in a brain abscess model in mice. This whole issue of the immunomodulatory effects of antibiotics, I have always thought was a crock. So I have another article here to start to weed away my deeply held beliefs. That's what I hate about evidence-based medicine, is that when the evidence comes out, you actually have to change your opinion. At least in the realms of politics, sex, and religion, I can remain ignorant and stupid as long as I want and can ignore the data. The good news out of the World Health Organization is that infectious diseases are emerging more quickly and spreading faster than ever and are becoming increasingly difficult to treat. I think that's good news because I'm an infectious disease doctor, and it gives me something to do every day, although most of these patients, unfortunately, are probably not insured. This spread, in part, is mediated by human migration and human travel. The interesting thing is how infectious diseases are being used to look at how humans have settled the world. I've talked in the past in these podcasts on the studies that have looked at Helicobacter and how following Helicobacter types in humans can help indirectly see how humans spread across the world. This has now been done with HTLV1 subtype C, where they have used HTLV to look at how the Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were colonized by looking at how this virus spread with humans. Fascinating how infectious diseases apply to everything from the molecular to the world. Again, I think we are the only true holistic physicians. And that brings us to the end of another wordy infectious disease podcast review of the infectious disease literature for the last 2 weeks of August 2007. As always, this is CME accredited, so take the online quiz and get a half an hour of free CME. Thank you, Legacy Health Systems. The references, as always, are on the website, and now there's a button marked PubMed, which if you click will take you right to the abstract in PubMed and allow you to explore this in more detail, since the nice thing about PubMed is it has the related links feature. I think it's amazing what you can do with computerized medicine. The music is, as always, by my son when he was 12, improvising on the guitar. He's a wicked guitar player now. And as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I will continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation, goodbye.